Japan's most immediate concern about China really comes down to Taiwan. Beijing views the island democracy as a rogue province destined to fall under Chinese control. For many, that could mean an eventual invasion.
We need all democracies around the world to look at the situation in this region so that we can rise up and say no to China's expansionism. In this regard, I need to say that the Canadian government, as well as the United States, UK, Australia, Japan, and etc., have been saying that they oppose the unilateral change of status quo in this part of the world. And that is highly welcomed. And we hope the international community, especially among the fellow democracies, should continue to tell China that they should not resort to the use of force against any country at all.
That's a clip from Rosemary Barton's interview with Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu. You can watch that full interview this Sunday on Rosemary Barton Live. Now, here to dig into the growing concerns about China is Brett Bruen. He is the president of Global Situation Room and previously served as director of global engagement in the Obama White House. Mr. Bruen is in Alexandria, Virginia. So, Brett, Japan is embarking on its biggest military buildup since the Second World War, ending decades, really, of pacifist military policy. What does this say about the security situation in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, without question, not only China, North Korea, Russia itself is a threat to Japan. And so what we are seeing over the last several years, and certainly the last several months, is a recognition that Japan cannot be complacent, the world cannot be complacent about these threats. I think it's welcome news here in Washington, where the U.S. for some time has been pushing Tokyo to be more assertive in the defense both of itself as well as the broader Indo-Pacific region.
It's alarming and fascinating at the same time to see both Germany and Japan remilitarizing, rapidly for the first time since the Second World War because of these authoritarian countries. And, if China were to engage in a military operation, as Japan fears, the most obvious target is Taiwan. So what's your sense? Do you think a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is inevitable at this point?
Well, I see two scenarios. One, China is obviously studying very closely and concerned by what happened to Russia when they launched the invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, Xi Jinping is under enormous pressure domestically because of these huge COVID outbreaks, because of the downturn in the economy. And I think if he is looking to try to shore up domestic support, we may see him try to undertake what Biden termed at this time last year a minor incursion of Taiwan. Could be some of those islands off of the coast to have a show of strength and to send a message both internationally, but more importantly, domestically.
So game this out for us. I mean, what happens if China does make an aggressive move, does invade Taiwan or have some sort of a military incursion there? I mean, how does the West respond to something like that?
Well, that would be a test. And I think it was precisely the weakness in our position that Biden was referring to with Ukraine. What does the West do in that situation? Do we treat it as a full-on invasion, which requires, as Biden has now pledged, a U.S. military response? Now, bear in mind, and viewers in Canada will know, that there isn't a NATO equivalent for Asia. So who responds? Is it, the coalition of the willing that was famously cobbled together in the run-up to the Iraq War? That's not obvious. I will say, and what's important about today's move is the more that can be done as the start, as a deterrent, I think the less likely we are to see, whether it's in Japan or for that matter in Taiwan, an effort by China to test the West's resolve on this.
I was just in Mexico City at the North American Leaders Summit, and the economic conversation was about building a North American semiconductor industry, because 90% of the high-end chips and stuff that we use in our economy here comes from Taiwan. And it seems like the concern over the security of that and the safety of that supply is driving a lot of this, right? And so you have Taiwan's foreign minister. He wants Western democracies to rise up and say no to Chinese expansionism. Are they up to that task in that region without that military alliance that you talk about?
Well, I think this is something that needs a lot more focus, and we were complacent in our preparations for Ukraine, and for that matter, for Europe more broadly. And I think we have to learn the right lessons and now apply them to Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, other allies across the region. It is important, as you bring up, we also very closely look at our supply chains, not just in semiconductors, but even things like medicines. We saw this at the outset of the pandemic, medical supplies. All of those have to be less dependent on Chinese manufacturing. I think we do need to look at nearshoring, whether it's to Mexico, other parts of Latin America, or indeed parts of Asia. And we've started to see it. Apple moved a manufacturing facility out of China into India. I think there will be more to come on that front.
Just one final question on Japan and what's happening there. There's a remilitarization aspect, but also the Prime Minister is on a tour of G7 capitals and a much more outward-looking view than we've seen from past Japanese prime ministers, sparked by what's happening in Russia, what's happening in China. How does that change the equation in the Indo-Pacific region? A more outward-looking Japan, and one that could end up getting things like Tomahawk missiles from the United States to have counterstrike capability for the first time in decades.
I think it's welcome, especially and quite frankly, because American leadership across the Indo-Pacific region has been drawn into question over the last several years, not only during President Trump's presidency, but also in the last several years. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think, shook the confidence of a lot of leaders in the region. So Japan, Australia, others standing up, asserting their commitment and their resolve, their investment in defense sends a strong signal, certainly to Beijing and to Moscow as well.
Okay, Brett, always a pleasure. That's Brett Bruen in Alexandria, Virginia. Thanks.
You bet.